Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and in today's video, I want to give you an easier way to work the sleeves in your bottom-up sweaters. So I'm going to talk to you about how I provisionally cast on my sleeves rather than knitting them separately and attaching them to the main body of the sweater. Now here I have a Weatherman sweater, which is a beautiful bottom-up sweater that is knit in Lopi yarn, and it's completed with a beautiful circular yoke. Now the traditional instructions for this sweater, which you'll find in the pattern, tells you to knit the body, as I've done here, all the way up to the join for the arms. These are the armpit sleeves held off on waste yarn, and then set this whole thing aside and knit the sleeves. But I don't really want to do that. What I want to do is continue working on the body and the yoke, and then go back and knit the sleeves later. And I want to knit them from the top down so that they're more seamless and easy to work with. So let me show you what I'm talking about in a drawing, which might be a little bit easier to see. So in a typical bottom-up construction for a sweater, you would knit 3 different pieces, your main body and your 2 sleeves separately. Then, once everything is the right length, you would join them together by knitting across the front of your work or the back of your work, over one of the sleeves, across the opposite side of your work, and then over one of the sleeves, connecting it all in an oval kind of shape, and then you continue to work up until your yoke was complete. Now what I'm proposing here is that provisional cast on for the sleeves. So all you're knitting is the body, and you're not knitting the sleeves. These are little phantom sleeves. And instead, once you get to the point where your body is long enough, you're going to provisionally cast on these sleeves. Now, a provisional cast on means that you have live stitches going in both directions. And that means that you can work the rest of your yoke without ever having to work your sleeves. Then you can go back later and pull out your provisional cast on, the bottom side of it, and work with those live stitches to knit your sleeves down in the opposite direction than they would be typically knitted, which is up toward the armpit. So I'm going to show you how I do that in the Weatherman sweater. So here's the Weatherman sweater body, and it's a very simple body knit from the bottom up. And I've reached a place where the body is long enough to the armpits. And I've gone around, and at each armpit I have put a certain number of stitches for my size on waste yarn. Now, if the stitches that are on waste yarn are live stitches, and once I provisionally cast on the rest of the sleeve stitches, I'll be able to pick those right up along with my other live stitches and just knit the sleeve down. I've gotten myself into position where this is the beginning of the round for joining the sleeves, and instead of joining the sleeves, I'm going to create these little phantom sleeves by provisionally casting on the stitches that would be there for the sleeves. We're going to need a couple of things. In addition to your body and the yarn that you're working with, you'll also need a few stitch markers, depending on your pattern, of course. My pattern is all stockinette to this point, and so I don't need any special stitch markers to separate out any kind of stitch patterns or anything like that. I just need a beginning of round marker and then 3 other markers. I'm going to use the beginning of round marker right here, and then I'm going to place 1 marker at each of the other 3 places where I begin or end that provisional cast on for the sleeves, just so that I know where it is. The other thing you'll need is some waste yarn for your provisional cast on. Now, some people use their extra cords that they might have in an interchangeable needle set. I prefer waste yarn just for its flexibility in this process. Once everything is stabilized and I've provisionally cast on all my stitches and worked a few rows, I'll likely go back and put my cords in place of the waste yarn. But as far as casting on stitches, this is my tool of choice. Now the last thing you'll need is to know how many stitches to cast on. It's kind of a key thing. And you'll find that in your pattern because in the instructions for knitting that sleeve all the way up to the point at which it would be joined, your pattern should give you a number of stitches that you would have at that upper point when you're going to join it to the main body. And often of those stitches, remember your sleeve is going to be a big circle, of those stitches you'll probably be holding a number of them on waste yarn to be joined with these body stitches later when you either Kitchener them together or join them in some other way. So make sure that the stitch number that you use includes the stitches of the sleeve minus whatever stitches are being held off on waste yarn for that actual armpit. So in my case, I've done a little math and modification, and I know I need to cast on 55 stitches from this point at the beginning of the underarm to the back here of the underarm for my provisionally cast on sleeve. So let's get down to work and I'll show you how I do it. Now different knitters are going to have different ways of provisionally casting on these stitches. I'm just going to show you my favorite way of the moment. And typically with a provisional cast on, you're going to have your waste yarn and you're going to have your working yarn. And you're often, depending on where you're doing your provisional cast on, sometimes it's at the very beginning of a project. And so you would need to take your waste yarn and your working yarn and tie a little knot to keep them together. And then you would work with them over here. And you'd just be dealing with this knot. Now, I don't have a knot, I just have my working yarn directly attached to my needle, and I don't want to pull those stitches off. So one of the things that I do is I take my waste yarn and I tie a little knot to my working yarn. It's not going to mess anything up, I promise. It's not going to distort any of these stitches. It's just going to serve the purpose of keeping these two yarns together and act a little bit like the stabilizer that you'd have if you were just starting a provisional cast on at the beginning of a project. I'm going to clear the way here and I'm going to keep my working yarn at the bottom, and I often will tension this just to keep my needle straight and held by just holding onto the other end of my waste yarn here. I'm going to put my fingers in between my waste yarn on top, which is the white yarn, and my working yarn on the bottom, which is my lopey yarn. So when I'm ready to actually start casting on, I'm going to take that beginning of round marker, which I use as a different color than the other marker, and put that right on there just so that I know where those cast on stitches begin. So the first stitch is going to look a little bit like a yarn over. I'm just going to dip down in the middle and pull that one up. You can see it's just kind of sitting there on the needle. And then for the next stitch, I'm going to go all the way to the back, under both, and then back through the middle. And you'll see that I've popped a second stitch onto my needle there. So I have two stitches right now. That one that looked kind of like a yarn over, and then the second one. So I have two, I need to get to 55. My next one I'm going to do again, dip into the middle and just do what looks like a little yarn over. Then around the back, underneath both strands, back through the middle. And you see if you kind of tug that waste yarn just a little bit, you'll make the working yarn pop to the top there. So now I have 4 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to do it all over again. So down to catch that one, then around behind both of them, and down through the middle, and there's another one. So I have 6 now. And what I'm going to do is continue this process until I have 55 stitches on my needle, and then we'll come back and I'll show you what to do next. So I've reached 55 stitches, and as you can see, that final stitch was just the yarn over, just like that. Now that's going to seem a little awkward because it's just kind of hanging out on the end of your needle. So you just want to hold it there for a second. And I like to get my waste yarn kind of in front of that stitch so that it's held. See how it's held there like that? And then take my working yarn to the back of my work because I'm going to continue knitting now over in stockinette stitch. So just to remind you what we did, we got to the armpit of our sweater where we've already put a few stitches on waste yarn. We attached our waste yarn, our different piece of waste yarn, to our working yarn just to give us some stability. We put in our marker and I added 55 stitches to my needle. Now these stitches are my sleeve. It's hard to believe that right now, but those are sleeve stitches, and they're live in both directions. So I can continue knitting around and around, and the work will grow in this direction. But because I have this waste yarn attached down here, I can pick those stitches right back up. You'll see that in a minute. And those stitches are going to be live going in the other direction, which means that I can pick up all these stitches and work my sleeve downward, just like you would for, say, a top-down sweater. Okay, so I've secured my extra stitch by pulling my waste yarn here. I have my working yarn at the back, and what we're going to do is go over here to the other side of the armpit, and we can put a marker in just so we can remember where those sleeve stitches are. And then all we're going to do is knit I keep my waist yarn down here to hold everything tight. We're going to knit this stitch, and we're going to work just typically like you would around the other stitches of your sweater. Oops. Just going to get a few more on here so that I can go back and show you what's going on. Okay, let me get my waist yarn out of the way. So if we were to spread this out, you see that we have our body stitches going this way. We've provisionally cast on our sleeve stitches, and we have our other live underarm stitches on waist yarn. So all of these stitches are live, and all we have to do is come back with our needle and our cord and pick up those stitches, and we can knit in this direction to create a sleeve going downward. Now what I'm going to do here for the rest of this back of the sweater is I'm going to continue to knit, and you can see that the waist yarn here it's all stabilized. It's perfectly fine, and it'll be just fine when we come back around and knit it. So I'm going to continue to knit across until I get to the next sleeve, and I will show you how I provisionally cast on over there as well. Okay, so I have knit around the back of my sweater, and I'm now at the other armpit. You can see this is the side of the sweater where I have a split hem, so I know where I am. This is where I've already put a number of stitches on waist yarn for that armpit, and I'm going to do the exact same thing here that I did on the other side. So I'm going to take my waist yarn, and as I did before, I'm going to tie a little knot just for stability. Other people will probably have different ways of doing this. It's just one of my little tricks that I do for myself. And again, we want our waist yarn on top, our working yarn below, and you'll notice that I switch sides with my working yarn to the side that I typically wouldn't hold it on for regular old knitting. And I want to make sure that my yarn is set behind like it normally would. Don't want to do anything different here. And again, I'm going to use this little tail for some stability over here. And I have my waist yarn up top and my working yarn down below. The last thing I'm going to do for myself is put a little stitch marker here. And then I'm going to start the process all over again. So I'm going to take one stitch here, then go around and under both pieces, up and through the middle to get my second stitch. And it's okay if you have to readjust your hands while you're doing this. Readjust your waist yarn and your working yarn. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not going to go anywhere. And then I'm going to do the same thing. Pick up that little stitch there, go around and under both, and back through the middle to get that next stitch. Always keeping my waist yarn on top and my working yarn on the bottom. And one thing to keep in mind too is if you're worried about losing count, you always remember that your odd stitch, in this case, is going to be that first little yarn over kind of stitch. And your even stitch is going to be that one. So right now I should have 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my 7th stitch is always going to be that one. And my 8th stitch is going to be the little more complex, going around and under stitch. So I'm going to continue on with my stitches here until I get to the other side, and I'll show you one more time what I do over here, and then we'll get into how to work these actual stitches when you go around on your first row, dealing with these stitches as they are. So here I am at the end of my provisional cast on again, and I have 55 stitches cast on, and again I have that little wonky stitch at the end there, which just seems like it wants to fly off. So I'm going to reverse the order here, pull the working yarn to the back and pull my waist yarn to the front just to secure that stitch. And now I can move my working yarn back over to the right for me, since I'm going to be throwing my stitches. Find my needles here. And again, you can see we've provisionally cast on stitches that are going to serve as our sleeve over the gap where that armpit is. Now all we're going to do is grab our other needle and start. Oh, I guess we should put our stitch marker in. I almost forgot. That'll just help us identify where those sleeve stitches are as we get farther and farther in. We're just going to reach in here, and I'm going to try to grab that waste yarn over here just to keep it secure. And then we're just gonna knit like stockinette. Easy peasy. I'll get a few stitches in to show you what it looks like. Get that waste yarn out of the way now. So you can see we have a couple pieces of waste yarn here. This waste yarn is for our held off armpit stitches, and then this waste yarn is attached to our provisional cast on up here. So you can see we've created yet another little oval for the sleeve. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna knit all the way across the front of the work, and then I'll meet you back and we'll talk about how to work across this first row of these stitches. Okay, so we've completed our provisional cast on for both sleeves, and I'm back at the beginning. You can see here's my purple beginning of round stitch marker. So these right here are the sleeve stitches, and as I said, since they're provisionally cast on, I can continue to work them up to the yoke, but then once I release the stitches from the waste yarn, I can also pick up all these live stitches and work the sleeve downward with no problem. For right now, I'm just going to show you how to work across your first row with these stitches because they look a little bit funny and it might seem a little bit intimidating and you don't want to miss a stitch or something like that. But let's just work across them. And no need to be scared. They're just stitches sitting on a needle and they're unlikely to get all twisted up or anything like that. You don't have to worry too much about that because the waste yarn is wanting to hold them all in place and they all want to be in the right spot on the needle. Now the trickiest part sometimes is if you have a little hitch in your needle, getting those stitches to come forward enough to be able to work them. So I worked the first stitch already, and I think you can see here, I'm going to try to get the camera to focus in on it. We have our waste yarn running through all of these stitches, and that's because that waste yarn is holding the place of the live stitches that are going to go in the other direction. So when we go to work these stitches, we want to just work this top part, the working yarn, and it looks like you're just knitting into like a yarn over, but that's okay. It's going to look just like a normal stitch once you get things moving, because you can see that the waste yarn is holding the place of this little stitch right here that you will turn around and work in the other direction eventually. Okay, that was the first stitch. Here's another one. And here, see, this one presents itself just a little bit differently. I'm going to go underneath like that, leaving the waste yarn down below. Same here, we're going to go into just the working yarn, leaving the waste yarn down below. And again, just under the working yarn, leaving that waste yarn down below. Not going to mess with that waste yarn, just the working yarn. And you're just going to do this all the way across your 55 stitches. And by the time you return to these stitches, they're going to look much more normal to you. They're going to look less scary and fragile and more like just typical stitches. And I think you can already see that here. They're starting to just look like very stable knit stitches, and you can start to see where that waste yarn is sitting right in the midst of all these live stitches, which will be really easy to pick up later for our sleeve. So I'm going to keep working my way across. One thing to note is that if you are working a specific pattern, like this sweater, very quickly after joining the sleeves to the body, very quickly transitions into the color work of the yoke. So in fact, on this first round, I should be technically knitting my first color work row from the chart. But because these stitches are a little bit fragile and because one row isn't going to make a huge bit of difference, I'm just going to work them plain all the way around to make sure that everything is very stable before I start any kind of two-handed color work that might take my concentration away from just simply making sure that these stitches all end up in the right orientation on my needles. I'm almost across here, and I can feel the panic in your eyes as you see this waste yarn bump kind of coming around, spinning on the needle. It's really not a big deal because you know where you're knitting is over here. So all you're going to do is turn that waste yarn that way, and it'll go right down to the bottom again. No problem. We're not getting any kind of twisting happening here. I am getting a little hitch on my needle. There we go. And if these stitches look a little bit loose, trust me, it all works itself out tension-wise. It's nothing to worry about. So we're just going to keep working just that working yarn, leaving the waste yarn down below, all the way across until we finish. And we'll know when we've finished because we'll get to that little convenient stitch marker that we left ourselves so that we know where our sleeve stitches are separated from our body stitches. Now, if you get to a place like this where it looks, like there are 2 stitches stuck together, just make sure you tease them apart a little so that you're only working 1 stitch at a time. There's no reason to knit 2 together in this situation. You want to make sure that you're working each individual stitch as you go across your sleeve stitches. And we're getting very close to the end here. And you can see I'm moving a little bit faster, moving with a little bit more confidence. Hopefully you are too. Working that working yarn. And you can see we've got about 5 stitches left to go. And then we're done. And these sleeve stitches are going to be totally stabilized, and our waste yarn is going to be perfect. There we go. So that's our last one. That's going to look a little loose, and that's okay. We're going to keep our waste yarn holding on to that stitch. We're going to push our stitch marker, and we're going to continue. Might want to tighten it up just a little bit. Kind of like with a cable. That first stitch, give it a little extra tug on both the waste yarn and the working yarn. And then you just continue across your stitches as you normally would. So you can look back and see that here are all of our nice stitches, and they're just like when you join sleeves to a body, you're going to notice that it's going to be a little bit it's a little tricky sometimes to keep everything on the cord from wanting to get distorted and stretched a little bit. If you need to, you could pull an end of your cord through, like you would with a magic loop or something, to relieve some of that pressure, because you can see it's starting to bow up just a little bit. We have a lot of extra stitches here that we didn't have before, but it's not going to be a problem. Once you work a couple more rounds, everything will kind of flatten out and ease up, and you're not going to have any worry at all. So I'm going to finish all of my provisional go round, and then I'm going to come back and show you how to put those stitches onto a cord so that you can actually work them in the other direction. Okay, as promised, we are finished with our provisional cast on, and you can see that the sweater has these little fake sleeve caps going on over here. They look like little monster mouths or something. And I just wanted to show you how I pick up those stitches around the armhole and put them on a cord now that everything's complete. Now, it is a little bit easier if you're new to this. It can be a little bit easier to wait to do this until you have a few more inches of fabric above your provisional cast on. It's just a little bit more stable, a little bit easier to see the stitches, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you how to do basically how to pick up those stitches so that you can know what to do. So I'm using a small cord because I'm just going to leave these are just sleeve stitches. I'm not working them. I don't need to do magic loop or anything like that. And I have the same size or a size smaller needles that I'm going to use for picking up these stitches. Now the first thing, because I tied that little knot in the beginning, I just need to get in there and get rid of my knot. And that is going to be our first stitch there. Like I said, it's going to be a little bit tricky to see, but if you can kind of roll your work down, you can see right where the waste yarn is moving through those stitches. So right here is a loop, for example, and right here, and those are the things that we're going to go in and pick up. So our first one's going to be here, our second one's going to be right here, and then we're just going to move across, basically slipping our needle to follow wherever that waste yarn goes. So you see the waste yarn is traveling right through that little loop there, and then it's traveling through that loop and this loop. You can kind of get the rhythm of it as you go. So you can see that our live stitches are up here on this red cord. I think you can see that. And our provisionally cast on live stitches at the bottom that I'm putting through the needle here, you can see that the waste yarn follows pretty much directly along there. See, I'm putting my needle right through those loops, following the path of that waste yarn. So that's the easiest way to think about it. So there's another one, and another one. And the main thing here is you don't want a sharp needle. You don't want a needle that's going to grab a piece of that waste yarn. You're just trying to move alongside the waste yarn so that it has its own integrity and it's not being bothered by your needle at all. You can see we're going right through these stitches here. There are these little loops. And if you ever get too many on your needle, you can always pull through the entire needle and just use the cord. I'm perfectly comfortable just doing it like this. When things get bunched up, you can set them apart. Just keep your working stitches on the top there and keep your waste yarn stitches down below. And again, like I said, if you're new to this, it's easier to do this once you have a few inches of fabric. That'll make sure that you're not going to get any twists in here. Accidental twisting is not what you want to do. We're just going to work our way through each of these loops, following the path of that waste yarn. Okay, and again, if you spread these out and look down below, you can see that we're just following along parallel to that waste yarn. So I'm just going to finish up grabbing these stitches and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so I've worked my needle, my second needle, all the way through those loops created by and held by the waste yarn. And again, you can see the waste yarn is running right there alongside my needle. There it is. And if you spread them out, you can kind of see it a little bit easier, I think. Now you can double check that you've gotten them all by counting your stitches. So just go back to the beginning here. You can see where the waste yarn starts. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on, all the way around your work until you get to the end. And I've counted these, I know I have 55. Now the scary thing is, at the end here, you can just simply pull out your waste yarn. And all your stitches are alive and well and sitting on that second cord. Now what I'll do for the sleeve is I'll go down here to these stitches that are also on waste yarn. I'll likely pick up an extra stitch over here and over here just to close the holes that sometimes happen in armpits. But these are just live stitches just like the ones we just looked at, and you can just run your needle parallel again to that waste yarn and pick all of those stitches up to make your complete circle for your sleeve. So if we back up the camera a little bit and look at the sweater as a whole, my cord isn't quite long enough for you to see everything, but over here at least you can see we have 2 cords going on for those sleeve stitches. And over here we have the same thing. We have all of our sleeve stitches sitting there on our main needles. And that is exactly what we want, because now we can continue to knit in the round, working our way up toward the collar of the sweater. And these stitches will sit right here on this cord and be ready for us to knit them going in the opposite direction when we're ready to knit those sleeves. So if we look back at our original explanation, hopefully it makes a little bit more sense now. Instead of knitting 3 distinct pieces and then working them together across the live stitches at the top of the sleeves, we've instead worked 1 piece, just the body, and we've provisionally cast on those sleeve stitches as if on the top of these imaginary sleeves. And those provisionally cast on sleeves allow us to work both up toward finishing the yoke and then later down to finishing the sleeves. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below or send me an email at knittingthestash@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Happy knitting!